All right, so today we're going deep on something uh, pretty fascinating.
Oh, yeah.
A turning point, you could say, in U.S. China relations
Okay.
during the Trump administration.
Interesting.
And, a lot of people, when they think about this period,
Yeah.
they think about trade deals, right?
Right, right.
But we're going way deeper than that.
Okay.
We've got some really interesting perspectives to kind of compare and contrast today.
I'm all ears.
We've got excerpts from retired Lieutenant General H.R. McMaster's book, Battlegrounds, The Fight to Defend the Free World.
Okay.
And then also some analysis from this Chinese political commentator, Zhang Shuji.
Interesting.
And they both kind of point to Trump's 2017 visit to China as way more than just a trade mission.
Right.
So that's what we're going to be looking at.
I mean, because it was touted as like this big
Huge.
century trade deal kind of thing.
Right.
But what's interesting is that McMaster suggests that Trump knew it wasn't going to be this groundbreaking deal that it was presented as. So the real story is kind of going on behind the scenes.
So for those who need a refresher, this century trade deal, it was basically Trump's attempt to renegotiate trade with China, aiming for billions of dollars in new deals.
Yeah. Yeah.
Huge news at the time.
Right. Everyone was talking about it.
But you're saying McMaster is suggesting that? Like there was more going on, like beneath the surface?
Yeah, and this is where Zhang Zhuji's analysis of the Chinese state media coverage comes in.
Yeah.
He points out that the coverage very heavily emphasized this Middle Kingdom narrative.
Oh, interesting.
China as the center of the world, right.
Right.
And so it's the subtle way of positioning other countries, even one as powerful as the U.S., in a subordinate role.
So projecting this image of power domestically and internationally.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, I can see how that sets the stage for some tension.
Right.
Were there any specific events during the visit that stand out as, like, examples of this power dynamic?
Well, there's one rather striking incident where Trump had to sit through this 2-hour Peking opera performance.
Oh, wow.
And Zhang Zhuji argues that this was more than just a cultural exchange,
Oh,
that it was really a very deliberate move to
what?
showcase China's cultural dominance.
Wow.
So think about it, right?
Yeah.
You force the U.S. president to endure this lengthy performance in a foreign art form.
2 hours is a long time.
It is.
Even for opera enthusiasts.
Especially when you consider Trump's personality.
Right.
Right, his focus on image, projecting strength.
Right.
This must not have sat well with him.
No, I imagine...
But is there any evidence that this was a deliberate power play? Or are we reading too much into it?
That's a good question.
Well, in Chinese diplomacy,
Yeah.
cultural performances have historically been used as a way to kind of,
Assert.
assert dominance.
Okay.
There's this long tradition of using these kinds of events to send very subtle messages about power dynamics.
Interesting.
If you look at the Chinese media coverage of the opera incident, you can see how they framed it as a sign of respect. The U.S. acknowledging China's cultural importance.
That's a really interesting point.
Yeah.
So it's not just the event itself, it's also how it's presented.
Exactly.
And interpreted, right.
Right.
That adds to this whole power dynamic.
It really makes you wonder how much of this visit was very carefully choreographed.
By the Chinese government.
Exactly.
Well, wow.
And this brings us to another key incident, the Matt Pottinger situation.
Right.
Pottinger was this former journalist
Okay.
who became a key figure in Trump's National Security Council.
Hey.
He was fluent in Mandarin.
Oh, wow.
And he had actually been physically assaulted by Chinese security forces while he was reporting in China years before.
Okay, so he already had a somewhat tense history with the Chinese government.
Yeah, you could say that.
What happened during the visit?
So during the trip, Pottinger was barred from entering the Forbidden City.
Wait, the Forbidden City?
Yeah.
That's incredibly symbolic.
Right.
The historic heart of China.
They wouldn't let a senior member of the U.S. delegation enter.
Why?
Both McMaster and Zhang Shuji see this as a deliberate snub.
A message.
A message, yeah.
Okay.
And in Chinese culture, these kinds of actions speak volumes.
Right.
The Forbidden City is not just a tourist site.
Right.
It's a symbol of Chinese power and authority.
Right.
By blocking Pottinger, they were essentially saying, we decide who enters the inner sanctum of our power.
That's a pretty bold statement.
It is.
It makes you wonder how all of this impacted the way the U.S. viewed China going forward.
Yeah.
Did these events influence the overall direction of U.S. policy towards China?
Absolutely. These incidents, combined with a lot of other observations, led McMaster and his team to some pretty stark conclusions about the Chinese Communist Party's intentions.
Okay, so let's unpack those conclusions.
Okay.
What did McMaster see as the key takeaways from this 2017 China visit and its aftermath?
So after the trip, McMaster and his team developed 5 key judgments about the Chinese Communist Party. And these judgments had a major impact on the direction of U.S. policy.
All right, hit us with those judgments. What did they conclude?
So their first judgment was that the Chinese Communist Party has no intention of pursuing economic or political liberalization.
All right.
Essentially, they saw the hope that economic growth would lead to democratic reforms in China as a fantasy.
So they basically concluded that China wasn't going to become more like the West anytime soon.
Right.
Okay, what was the second judgment?
Second, they assessed that the Chinese Communist Party has no intention of playing by the established rules of the international order.
Oh, wow.
Instead, they seek to kind of rewrite those rules in their favor,
Okay.
to create a global system that benefits them, even if it means undermining existing norms.
So not just playing the game, but changing the rules of the game entirely.
Exactly.
Ambitious, to say the least.
Yeah.
Okay, what was their third judgment?
Third, McMaster and his team concluded that China would continue to use espionage to steal technology and gain an advantage. This wasn't a new concern, but they saw it as a core part of China's strategy to surpass the U.S. in areas like artificial intelligence and advanced manufacturing.
Not exactly playing fair, but I guess all's fair in love and global competition.
Right.
Okay, 2 more judgments to go.
Okay.
What was the fourth?
The fourth judgment was that China is actively seeking to expand its regional influence and establish a leadership position in Asia, one that specifically excludes the U.S.
Wow, that's a direct challenge to U.S. power and influence in the region.
It is.
And finally, the fifth judgment.
Fifth, they determined that China is actively exporting its model of authoritarian capitalism,
Okay.
which they see as a direct challenge to free markets and democratic systems around the world.
So this is where the ideological clash really comes into focus.
Yeah.
It's not just about economic competition or regional influence.
Right.
It's about 2 fundamentally different visions for how society should be organized,
Exactly.
how the world should be run.
Right. And these 5 judgments, formed in the wake of Trump's 2017 visit, became the foundation for a much more hawkish U.S. policy towards China.
Okay.
And we'll delve into what that actually looked like in the next part of our deep dive.
All right, listeners, stay tuned for part 2, where we'll explore how those 5 judgments shaped the U.S. response to China and what it all means for the future of global order.
It's going to be good.
So we just heard about McMaster's 5 key judgments by the Chinese Communist Party.
Right.
And how those judgments kind of set the stage for this shift in U.S. policy.
Yeah.
But before we get to the policy implications, I'm curious about one judgment in particular.
Okay.
The idea of a modern tributary system.
Right.
That sounds pretty intense.
It is a bold claim.
Yeah.
Essentially, McMaster is arguing that China is trying to reassert itself as the dominant power in Asia.
Okay.
But not through direct military conquest,
So interesting.
but through a more subtle form of economic and political leverage. And he sees echoes of the historical tributary system where neighboring states paid tribute to the Chinese emperor
Right.
in exchange for protection and trade.
So instead of sending actual gifts and bowing to the emperor,
Yeah.
what would this modern tribute look like?
Well, think about the Belt and Road Initiative, for example.
Okay.
It's this massive infrastructure project that China is funding in countries all over the world, but particularly in Asia and Africa.
Right.
And McMaster would argue that these investments come with strings attached,
Meaning?
that China is using them to gain political influence and economic control over these countries.
So you're saying that countries that accept these investments might feel pressured to align with China's policies
Exactly.
or prioritize Chinese interests,
Right.
even if it's not in their best interest.
Exactly.
Wow.
It's a way of creating a system where other countries become dependent on China.
Economically and politically.
Exactly.
And that dependence can be leveraged to shape their behavior?
Right.
That's a pretty concerning picture, especially for countries that might feel they have no choice but to accept these investments.
Yeah.
But is McMaster's view widely accepted?
Mm.
Do other experts agree with this modern tributary system interpretation?
It's definitely a controversial idea.
Okay.
Some experts would argue that McMaster is overstating China's intentions,
Yeah, okay.
that they're simply pursuing their economic interests in a pragmatic way.
Right.
They point out that China is also investing in developed countries like the U.S. and Europe,
Right.
not just developing nations.
So there's a debate about whether this is a deliberate strategy of domination
Yeah,
or just a natural consequence of China's economic growth.
Exactly. And it's important to consider both perspectives.
Right.
But even if we set aside the tributary system debate,
Yeah.
there's no denying that China's economic influence is growing rapidly.
Right.
And that's creating a whole new set of challenges
That's
for
right.
the U.S. and other countries.
Okay, so let's get back to those 5 judgments
Okay.
and how they actually influenced U.S. policy. You mentioned that they led to a more hawkish stance.
Right.
What does that mean in practice?
Well, to understand that, we need to explain what hawkish means in this context.
Okay.
In foreign policy, it basically refers to a more aggressive and confrontational approach,
Okay.
often prioritizing military strength and a willingness to use force to achieve objectives.
So less diplomacy, more military might.
Not necessarily. It's more about a shift in priorities
Okay.
and a willingness to take a tougher stance against perceived threats.
Okay.
In the case of China, it meant a greater focus on countering their military buildup,
Okay.
pushing back against their economic practices,
Yeah.
and building alliances with other countries concerned about China's growing influence.
So kind of like a containment strategy, similar to what the U.S. did with the Soviet Union during the Cold War.
There are definitely some parallels,
Okay.
but it's important to remember that the situation with China is much more complex.
In what way?
Well, they're deeply integrated into the global economy.
Right.
And many countries, including the U.S., rely heavily on trade with China.
Right.
So a full-blown containment strategy would be incredibly difficult, if not impossible, to implement.
So it's more of a balancing act.
Yeah.
Trying to counter China's influence without completely severing ties
Right.
or provoking a conflict.
Exactly.
And that's the dilemma that U.S. policymakers have been grappling with in the past few years.
It is.
Now, we know that Trump started this shift towards a tougher stance on China.
Yeah.
But what about Biden?
Mm.
Did he continue this approach or try to reset the relationship?
Well, there was some hope initially that Biden might take a less confrontational approach,
Right.
focusing more on diplomacy and cooperation.
Right.
But in reality, he's largely continued the hawkish policies of the Trump administration.
Why is that? You'd think a new administration would want to put its own stamp on foreign policy.
Well, this is where the influence of the Washington foreign policy establishment comes into play.
Oh, okay.
Essentially, it refers to the network of think tanks, academics, former officials, and policymakers who shape U.S. foreign policy thinking.
So kind of like a group of experts and insiders who have a lot of sway over how the U.S. interacts with the world.
Exactly.
Right.
And within this establishment, there's been a growing consensus that China poses a serious challenge to U.S. interests.
Okay.
And that a more assertive approach is necessary to counter that challenge.
Gotcha.
And that consensus has held strong across both Democratic and Republican administrations.
So even though Trump and Biden have very different political styles,
Yeah.
they're both operating within this broader framework of viewing China as a strategic competitor.
Exactly. And that's why we've seen a remarkable degree of continuity in U.S. policy towards China,
Right.
despite the change in administration.
Okay, so the U.S. is taking a tougher stance.
Yeah.
But what about the rest of the world?
Yeah.
Are other countries on board with this approach, or are they caught in the middle?
That's a crucial question. Because this rivalry between the U.S. and China is playing out on a global stage.
Of course.
And the choices that other countries make will have a major impact on how this all unfolds.
For example?
Well, take Europe.
Okay.
The U.S. has been trying to get European countries to align with them against China.
Okay.
But it's been a mixed bag.
In what way?
Well, some countries, like the UK and Poland,
Okay.
have been more willing to take a tough stance.
Okay.
But others, like France and Germany,
Yeah.
have been more cautious.
Why the hesitation? You'd think they'd be concerned about China's growing power, too.
They are,
Okay.
but they also have strong economic ties with China.
Right.
And they're not eager to jeopardize those relationships.
Right.
Plus, they're wary of getting dragged into a conflict that's not directly in their interests.
So they're trying to walk a tightrope,
Yeah.
balancing their concerns about China with their economic interests.
Exactly.
It sounds like there are no easy answers.
There aren't.
This U.S.-China rivalry is creating a lot of uncertainty
It is.
and forcing countries to make some tough choices.
Absolutely. And it's not just governments that are affected.
Well, right.
This rivalry is having a real impact on businesses, individuals, and communities all over the world.
Okay, so let's talk about those impacts.
Okay.
How is this rivalry playing out in the real world beyond the halls of government and diplomatic circles?
Well, for starters, think about the global economy.
Right.
We're already seeing disruptions in supply chains,
Right.
rising prices, and increased competition for resources.
Right.
And as the U.S. and China try to decouple their economies,
Yeah.
it's likely to get even more turbulent.
So you're saying that this rivalry could have a direct impact on our wallets,
Yeah.
on the cost of goods and services.
Exactly.
Wow.
And it's not just about prices.
Okay.
It also affects jobs, innovation, and access to technology.
Can you give us some specific examples?
Sure.
Okay.
Think about the semiconductor industry. Semiconductors are these essential components in everything from smartphones to cars to weapon systems.
Right.
Both the U.S. and China are trying to dominate this industry,
Okay.
which has led to shortages and price hikes.
Gotcha.
And this affects businesses that rely on these chips, and ultimately it trickles down to consumers.
So that new phone you've been wanting
Yeah.
might be more expensive
Right.
or harder to find
Exactly.
because of this competition between the U.S. and China.
Exactly.
Okay.
And this is just one example. We're
Yeah.
seeing similar dynamics play out in other industries,
Yeah.
from renewable energy to pharmaceuticals.
Okay, so the economic impact is pretty clear.
Yeah.
But what about the human dimension?
Right.
How is this rivalry listing ordinary people?
Well, one area where we're seeing a real impact is within Chinese diaspora communities.
Yeah.
As tensions rise between the U.S. and China,
Yeah.
some people of Chinese descent are feeling pressure to choose sides.
Wow.
They might face suspicion or discrimination based on their ethnicity. That's awful.
It is.
It's like this global rivalry is seeping into people's personal lives,
Yeah.
creating divisions and anxieties where they didn't exist before.
Exactly. And it's important to remember that people of Chinese descent are not a monolithic group.
Right.
They have diverse backgrounds, political views, and experiences.
Of course.
It's dangerous and unfair to make assumptions about their loyalties or intentions based on their ethnicity.
Absolutely. We need to avoid falling into those kinds of stereotypes and recognize the human cost of this rivalry,
Yeah.
the way it's impacting individuals and communities around the world.
Right.
It's not just about Chinese diaspora communities.
Right.
We're also seeing increased restrictions on academic exchanges, travel, and cultural collaborations between the U.S. and China.
Yeah.
This limits opportunities for people to connect with each other,
Yeah.
learn from each other,
Right.
and build bridges of understanding.
It does.
So this rivalry is not only creating economic and political tensions.
But it's also undermining people-to-people connections and cultural exchange.
Exactly.
It feels like we're at a crossroads. On the one hand, there are real concerns about China's behavior
Yeah.
and their challenge to the existing world order.
Right.
But on the other hand, escalating this rivalry could lead to a dangerous and unpredictable situation.
You've hit the nail on the head.
Yeah.
That's the central dilemma facing policymakers today.
Which is?
How to balance the need to protect their interests
Okay.
with the desire to avoid a catastrophic conflict.
So how do we move forward? Is there any way to navigate this complex and potentially dangerous landscape
Yeah.
without things spiraling out of control?
That's the million-dollar question.
Right.
There are no easy answers.
Yeah.
But one thing is clear.
What's that?
We need to move beyond simplistic narratives
Yeah.
and embrace the complexity of this relationship.
You mean we can't just see China as the enemy or the
Yeah.
U.S. as the hero?
Yeah.
We need to recognize the nuances,
Yeah.
the different perspectives,
Yeah.
the potential for both cooperation and conflict.
Exactly.
Gotcha.
We need to engage with China in a way that is both firm and principled,
Cool.
while also leaving space for dialogue and understanding.
Right.
It's a delicate balance, but it's essential if we want to avoid a future defined by hostility and mistrust.
Well said. And I think that's a great place to pause our deep dive for now.
Indeed, there's much more to explore, but this gives us a solid foundation to understand the complexities of the U.S.-China relationship.
We've spent the last two parts of this deep dive really dissecting this shift in U.S.-China relations,
Yeah.
especially after Trump's 2017 visit.
Right.
And it's become clear that this isn't just about like trade disagreements or diplomatic maneuvering.
No,
This is much deeper than that, right?
it is. It is.
We're talking about two completely different visions for how the world should work,
Right.
how power should be distributed, what values should be prioritized.
Exactly.
So let's break down these competing visions. What exactly is at stake here?
Well, on one side, you have the U.S.-led order that emerged after World War II.
Right.
It's a system that, at least in theory, emphasizes democratic values, free trade, and multilateral institutions like the United Nations and the World Trade Organization.
So the idea is that everyone plays by the same rules,
Right.
cooperates within these international organizations,
Yeah.
And the U.S. kind of acts as the guarantor of this system.
Right, and while the system has definitely had its flaws and inconsistencies,
Mhm.
think about interventions in the Middle East
Right.
or unfair trade practices.
Right.
But it has generally promoted a certain level of global stability and economic prosperity for many countries.
It's not perfect, but it's the system we've grown accustomed to.
Right.
Now, what about China's vision?
Okay.
How does it differ?
Well, China's vision emphasizes state sovereignty,
Okay.
non-interference in domestic affairs,
Okay.
and a move away from a U.S.-dominated world towards a more multipolar system where power is distributed among several major players.
So less emphasis on democracy and human rights,
Yeah.
and more on respecting each country's right to govern itself as it sees fit,
Right?
even if that means cracking down on dissent or limiting individual freedoms.
That's part of it.
Okay.
And this vision is appealing to some countries that have felt marginalized or exploited by the existing U.S.-led order.
Right.
They see China as offering an alternative,
Okay.
a path to development that doesn't require them to adopt Western-style democracy.
So China's not just talking about this new world order.
No,
They're actively trying to build it.
they are.
Right.
Right, think about the Belt and Road Initiative we discussed earlier.
Right.
It's a massive infrastructure project that spans continents, connecting China to dozens of countries through roads, railways, ports, and pipelines.
Right.
China is pouring billions of dollars into this initiative,
Yeah.
and it's seen as a way to expand their economic and political influence across the globe.
It's a bold move,
It is.
and it's definitely shaking things up.
Yeah.
But how are other countries reacting to this?
Hmm.
Are they being forced to choose between the U.S. and China?
It's a complex situation.
Yeah.
Some countries are aligning more closely with the U.S.
Okay.
out of shared security concerns or ideological affinity.
Like who?
You see this with countries like Japan, Australia, and Canada.
Makes sense.
Yeah,
They're traditional U.S. allies, and
Yeah.
they share democratic values.
exactly.
But what about countries that aren't so closely aligned with the West?
Well, many countries are trying to navigate a middle path.
Okay.
They don't want to alienate either the U.S. or China,
Right.
so they're trying to maintain good relations with both.
Gotcha.
This can be a tricky balancing act,
Yeah, I imagine so.
especially when it comes to issues like trade, technology, and security.
So it's not a simple binary choice between two superpowers.
Yeah.
It's a much more nuanced and fluid landscape,
Right.
with countries trying to maximize their own interests in a rapidly changing world.
Exactly.
This brings us to the central question of this deep dive. What does this shift in U.S.-China relations, this clash of visions, mean for the rest of the world?
Right.
Where do other countries fit into this new dynamic?
That's the big question.
We've focused a lot on the U.S. and China,
Yeah.
but it's important to remember that they're not the only players in this game.
No, they're not.
What are some of the potential scenarios for how this rivalry could play out?
Okay.
And how might it affect different regions and countries?
Well, one possibility is that we see the emergence of new blocs or alliances,
Okay.
with countries aligning more explicitly with either the U.S. or China.
Okay.
This could lead to a more divided world,
Okay.
with increased tensions and the risk of conflict.
It's kind of like a new Cold War,
Yeah.
but with different players and different ideological fault lines.
That's one possibility.
Okay.
But it's also possible that things remain more fluid,
Okay.
with countries shifting alliances depending on the issue or the situation.
Right.
We might see a more multipolar world, with power distributed among several major players, including the U.S., China, the EU, India, and others.
So a more complex and unpredictable world,
Right.
where it's harder to predict how things will play out.
Exactly. And this uncertainty, this lack of a clear roadmap for the future, is one of the most unsettling aspects of this new era.
It is a bit daunting, to be honest.
It is.
But knowledge is power.
Right.
So the more we understand about these complex dynamics,
Yeah.
the better equipped we are to navigate them.
Absolutely. And that's why it's so crucial to engage with these issues,
Yeah.
to understand the different perspectives,
Right.
and to think critically about the choices that lie ahead,
Right.
both for individual countries and for the world as a whole.
So what can our listeners do?
Right.
How can they stay informed and engaged with this crucial issue?
Well, for starters, stay curious.
Okay.
Read news from diverse sources, both Western and non-Western.
Right.
Look for analysis that goes beyond the headlines.
Okay.
And considers the nuances of the U.S.-China relationship.
Don't just get your news from social media or sound bites.
Right.
Dig deeper. Seek out different perspectives.
Yeah.
Challenge your own assumptions.
Exactly, and don't be afraid to engage in conversations about this,
Okay.
even if they're difficult or uncomfortable.
Right.
This is a global issue that affects us all.
Right.
And the more we talk about it, the better equipped we'll be to find solutions.
Well said.
Thank you.
And on that note, I want to thank you for joining us on this deep dive into this turning point in U.S. China relations.
My pleasure.
We've covered a lot of ground, but this is really just the beginning of a much larger conversation. It's a conversation that will continue to unfold in the years to come.
It will.
And it's one that we all have a role to play in shaping.
Absolutely.
Just keep learning, keep exploring, and keep engaging with this vital issue.
Couldn't have said it better myself.
Until next time, deep divers.
Huh.
Keep diving deep.